refuse to believe there hasn't been a single member of the royal family who hasn't, at some point in time, been mean to an aide.
I had heard about, the allegations of bullying long before the story broke. But then the decision for them to let that become public right at the same time as the Meghan and Harry sit down with Oprah Winfrey absolutely made it look like the whole thing was trumped up. You have to understand that something really did happen. The overstretched staffing, it was another thing, where she came in and then just the interest in her. You remember that, the level of interest. Everybody wanted something with her. But in terms of the way the palace saw it, she was a fairly junior member of the team. It's an incredibly hierarchical structure that does not know how to deal with these women who are more expressive. How many people marrying into that family have you seen live happily ever after? It really isn't an easy gig.
Fam, there is something deeply fascinating happening in the way the public has been encouraged to look at Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Because this isn't simply a story about two women who happen to belong to the same royal family. It is a story about perception. It is a story about framing. It is a story about what happens when two human beings are repeatedly presented to millions of people as opposing characters in a story they did not necessarily create themselves. And what makes this conversation so fascinating is that an ITV discussion has opened the door to precisely that question. Are Kate and Meghan really as different in the public imagination as they have been made to appear? Or have we been watching something much bigger unfold, a media narrative in which two women are repeatedly positioned against one another because the comparison itself generates attention? Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let's be clear. This isn't an argument that every journalist is malicious. It isn't an argument that every story about Kate is positive or every story about Meghan is negative. And it certainly isn't an argument that one woman must be completely innocent while the other must be completely responsible. Reality is much more complicated. But that's precisely why this conversation matters. Because when the media reduces complicated human beings into simple opposing characters, something important gets lost. Context. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than in the relentless comparison between Kate and Meghan. Think about how familiar the formula has become. Kate versus Meghan. Royal versus outsider. Traditional versus modern. Quiet versus outspoken. British versus American. Future Queen versus independent Duchess. And eventually the comparison becomes so deeply embedded that almost anything either woman does can be interpreted through that lens. A photograph of Kate isn't simply a photograph of Kate anymore. A photograph of Meghan isn't simply a photograph of Meghan. Instead, the audience is subconsciously encouraged to ask, what does this say about Meghan? What does this say about Kate? Who looks better? Who behaved better? Who is more authentic? Who is more popular? Who is winning? And that's where things become extremely interesting. Because why does everything have to become a competition? Why can't two women simply be different? Why must the success of one automatically be interpreted as the failure of the other? That question sounds simple, but it exposes something much bigger about modern media. We live in an environment where attention is incredibly valuable. A calm, complicated story often requires patience. A conflict story doesn't. Kate versus Meghan is instantly understandable. It creates teams. It creates emotion. It creates arguments. And arguments generate engagement. People click. People comment. People share. People rush to defend their favourite. And before long, the original event almost becomes irrelevant. The real product becomes the reaction. That is what makes the discussion about the so-called economy of hate so uncomfortable. Because hate doesn't necessarily have to mean extreme hatred. Sometimes it is simply a steady stream of irritation, suspicion, ridicule, and resentment. Enough negativity to keep people emotionally invested. Enough conflict to keep the conversation alive. Enough outrage to keep people returning. And this is where we need to become much more sophisticated as audiences. Because the question shouldn't simply be, is this article true or false? There is another question that can be even more revealing. Because sometimes the facts haven't been completely invented. Sometimes the event really happened. But the framing determines how we feel about it. And that distinction is enormous. Consider something as ordinary as a pregnant woman touching or cradling her baby bump. There is nothing inherently controversial about it. It is a completely normal gesture. Yet the public response can change dramatically depending on whose photograph we are looking at and what story surrounds it. For one woman, the gesture can be described as tender, maternal, beautiful, natural. For another, essentially the same behaviour can suddenly be interpreted as theatrical, attention-seeking, performative. And this is where media literacy becomes crucial, because the image itself may not have changed, the gesture may not have changed, the pregnancy may not have changed. What changes is the narrative placed around the image. One caption tells you to admire. Another tells you to judge. One invites affection. Another invites suspicion. And suddenly millions of people are looking at essentially the same human behaviour through completely different emotional filters. Now, does that automatically prove deliberate bias? No. And that's an important distinction. Journalism involves editorial decisions. Editors choose photographs. Writers choose language. Broadcasters choose which stories receive airtime. Different publications have different audiences and different editorial cultures. Sometimes bias can emerge without anybody sitting down and saying, let's create a double standard. It can emerge through assumptions, through familiarity, through expectations, through which narratives audiences have already been conditioned to accept. And that's arguably even more interesting, because if a particular narrative becomes established, journalists don't always have to repeat it explicitly. The audience already knows the script. Kate does something. People know how they're expected to interpret it. Meghan does something. People already have an expectation of what that means. And once those expectations become entrenched, confirmation bias takes over. People notice the evidence that confirms what they already believe. They ignore the evidence that complicates it. And suddenly, two women aren't being evaluated individually anymore. They're being evaluated according to pre-existing characters. The good royal, the difficult royal, the traditional one, the disruptive one. But here's the uncomfortable part. Real human beings don't work like that. People are complicated. People make mistakes. People have good days and bad days. People can be confident in one environment and uncomfortable in another. People can be traditional in some areas of their lives and progressive in others. And yet, celebrity culture often demands something much simpler. Heroes, villains, winners, losers. And when you add the monarchy into that equation, the stakes become enormous. Because the royal family isn't simply entertainment. It carries centuries of symbolism. It represents tradition for some people. For others, it represents privilege. For some, it represents national identity. For others, it represents an institution that desperately needs reform. And suddenly, Kate and Meghan can become symbols of arguments that are much larger than themselves. This is where the culture war element becomes so important. Because once a public figure becomes a symbol, people stop responding only to the person. They respond to what they believe that person represents. Meghan can become a symbol of change. Kate can become a symbol of continuity. And once that happens, every little event can become political in the broadest cultural sense. A dress, a speech, a photograph, a charity appearance, a facial expression, a parenting decision. Even the way someone walks into a room. Everything becomes evidence for whichever side people have already chosen. And that creates an extraordinary trap, because the two women can be turned into opposing symbols even when they themselves aren't participating in the supposed competition. Think about how powerful that is. If the audience is constantly told that Kate and Meghan are rivals, then every interaction becomes suspicious. Every silence becomes meaningful. Every absence becomes a statement. Every photograph becomes a clue. And suddenly, the audience isn't watching real people anymore. They're watching characters in a continuing television drama. Except this isn't fiction. These are real people. And the consequences of that distinction matter. Because when millions of people participate in a narrative long enough, the narrative can begin to feel like reality. That's why this ITV discussion is worth paying attention to. Not because ITV has somehow handed down a final verdict on Kate and Meghan, but because the conversation invites us to examine the machinery behind the comparison. And that is a much more interesting story. The question isn't simply, was Meghan treated unfairly? The question is, how does one person's mistake become a learning moment while another person's mistake becomes evidence of character? How does one person's confidence become leadership while another person's confidence becomes arrogance? How does one person's emotional reaction become vulnerability while another's becomes instability? Those questions aren't limited to royalty. They exist throughout celebrity journalism, throughout politics, throughout entertainment, and throughout social media. Because human beings are not naturally objective observers. We are storytellers. We look for patterns. We look for heroes. We look for villains. We want explanations. And media organizations understand that. The most powerful stories aren't necessarily the most complicated. They're the ones that allow us to understand a complicated world in a few seconds. That's why Kate versus Meghan is so powerful as a media construct. It takes a complex institutional story and turns it into a personal rivalry. Instead of asking about monarchy, media culture, racism, class, gender expectations, celebrity journalism, and institutional pressure, the audience is encouraged to ask, that's easier. It's also far more emotionally profitable. Because once you've chosen your side, you have a reason to keep watching. You have a reason to click the next article. You have a reason to argue with strangers. You have a reason to defend your favourite, and the cycle feeds itself. The media produces the comparison. The audience reacts to the comparison. The reaction creates more engagement. More engagement encourages more comparison. And eventually the comparison becomes self-sustaining. That is the economy of outrage. And perhaps the most powerful thing any viewer can do is simply refuse to participate blindly. Because you don't have to hate Kate to understand Meghan's experience. You don't have to dislike Meghan to appreciate Kate. You don't have to choose a team. You can look at an image and say, that's a lovely photograph. You can look at another and say, that was perhaps not the best decision, without turning either conclusion into a declaration of war. That kind of thinking might sound boring in today's attention economy, but perhaps that's precisely why it's valuable. Because nuance doesn't scream, nuance doesn't trend as easily. Nuance doesn't give you an instant villain, but nuance gets closer to the truth. And perhaps that's the real revelation hiding inside this discussion. Maybe the most important story isn't whether Kate has been treated better than Meghan. Maybe the deeper story is why society has become so comfortable demanding that women compete for approval in the first place. Why does one woman have to be the elegant one while another becomes the controversial one? Why can't both simply be human? And why are audiences repeatedly encouraged to judge women by standards that can shift depending on who is being discussed? Those are much harder questions, but they are also much more important. Because once you start examining the language, the photographs, the headlines, the omissions, and the emotional framing, you begin to realize that media narratives aren't just about what happened. They're about how what happened is presented. And presentation matters. The same event can generate sympathy or outrage depending on the frame. The same gesture can be celebrated or mocked. The same personality trait can be interpreted as confidence or arrogance. And when that happens repeatedly over years, it can fundamentally shape public perception. That doesn't mean we should automatically distrust every journalist. It means we should become better readers, better viewers, better thinkers. And perhaps most importantly, we should stop allowing other people to decide who our enemies are. Because here's the irony. The more fiercely people fight over Kate and Meghan, the more valuable the rivalry becomes. And perhaps the biggest winners aren't Kate or Meghan at all. Perhaps the winners are the people and platforms that benefit from keeping the argument alive. That's the part worth thinking about. Because if tomorrow there is another headline saying, "Before immediately choosing a side, ask yourself one simple question. Am I being informed, or am I being provoked? Am I being given context, or am I being handed a character? Am I being shown the whole story, or just the part most likely to generate a reaction?" Those questions can change everything. And that is why this ITV discussion deserves more than a passing glance. Because beneath the royal gossip is a much bigger conversation about how modern media constructs heroes and villains, how culture wars turn individuals into symbols, how outrage can become commercially valuable, and how easily audiences can be persuaded to fight battles that may never have been theirs to fight. Kate and Meghan are not simply two names in a headline. They're two human beings who have been placed under extraordinary public scrutiny. And perhaps the most radical thing we can do is stop pretending that understanding one requires destroying the other. Because the truth doesn't need a villain. The truth doesn't need a team. And the truth certainly doesn't need us to hate somebody in order to make sense of somebody else.